In February 2018, in the highly complex combat environment of war-torn Syria, American Special Forces suddenly found themselves in a wholly unprovoked armed confrontation with a mix of Syrian and Russian troops and armor. This was no minor accidental skirmish, but an hours-long nighttime encounter that was brutal, involving tank, anti-tank, aircraft, and artillery fire. It was the most violent encounter between American and Russian forces since the end of the Cold War, a quarter of a century ago. Let's dig into the factors that triggered this action, the course of the battle, and the outcome. Spoiler alert: what was to become known as the Battle of Khasham does not go well for the Russians. Avoiding Armageddon. In 2011, the Arab Spring saw millions of people across northern Africa and the Middle East demonstrating in favor of establishing democratic governments. After initial hope and excitement amongst the people, the dictators of this part of the world universally responded with brutal repression, arrest, intimidation, violence, and murder. The Syrian regime under President Bashar al-Assad was no exception, unleashing brutal security forces against the population. The people fought back. The country splintered into a highly destructive civil war that is still going on to this day. The turmoil and violence was exacerbated by the arrival of the Islamic State terrorist group in the form of ISIS, Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. ISIS thrived in the failed state and captured large parts of the ungoverned country. Russian forces also arrived in the country in order to support the Assad regime. American forces deployed into the power vacuum to target ISIS. The presence of American and Russian forces, both supporting different sides in the volatile region, meant a serious risk of accidental or even intentional armed clashes between the two. This held open possibilities of regional and even global escalation. A shooting war, from the American perspective, needed to be avoided at all cost. Russian and American troops, vehicles, and aircraft uneasily rubbed shoulders in the confused battle space, which now also included Iranian militia forces, Turkish-backed rebels, Kurdish forces, and Russian mercenaries. Security situation maps from that time resembled bizarre, multicolored jigsaw puzzles. But the Russians were looking for opportunities to provoke confrontations. Keen to push the US military presence out of Syria, the situation was tense, complicated, and volatile. Even to this day, the Russian military is jamming US military communications, flying dangerously, and driving aggressively in situations where Russian forces are close to the Americans. If you take a look at photographs and footage from this time, you will often see vehicles from all sides, sporting huge flags in order to ensure there is no doubt whatsoever about who is who, in order to try and minimize the risks of accidental attack. The Gathering Storm. On the 7th of February 2018, these low-level provocations were to turn into a full-scale pitched battle. A couple of dozen American Special Forces soldiers were based in an outpost in the oil field area of Deir al-Zawar. It is situated on the banks of the historic Euphrates River, which had now become the unofficial border between Assad regime forces on the West Bank and opposition forces on the east. The Americans were operating alongside anti-government forces and monitoring the security of oil installations in the area. They were located at the Konoko gas plant, 5 miles east of the Euphrates, and, with the territory sandy, flat, and smooth, they had a clear view westwards for a good 2 or 3 miles. In the afternoon and early evening, intelligence reporting started to warn the Americans on the ground of a possible buildup of hostile troops, vehicles, and equipment. This appeared to be a Syrian regime force, but there were indications that Russian personnel were involved in some numbers. The Russian mercenary group Wagner was known to be active in Syria and was also known for its close connections with the Russian government. Mercenaries were a very handy foreign policy tool for President Putin. It allowed the Russians to poke and provoke while maintaining deniability. The Russians could deny that they had any connection to a given incident and would claim that no Russian soldiers were involved. We have since seen on the battlefields of Ukraine exactly how closely connected Wagner was to the Russian government and the Russian army. But the high quality of US intelligence gathering kicked in. American drones were operating over the area and brought an essential live and continuous feed of information. Analysts huddled over screens trying to piece together what was happening and to predict what might happen next. One analyst monitoring the intelligence traffic noted, "I think part of the tell was that Russian doctrine says that they're going to do things that look like exercises right up into the point." The movement and composition of what was increasingly looking like a hostile force was becoming clearer by the hour, and it was a very troubling picture. Gathering in the dusk was a battle group of perhaps 500 soldiers, 3 T-72 main battle tanks, a few armored personnel carriers, and some heavy artillery and mortars. It seemed to be a mix of Syrians and Russians, but analysts subsequently believed there were many more Russians than Syrians. At any rate, it was a highly menacing force to a group of American soldiers outnumbered 10-1. But surely an out-and-out frontal attack was not being planned. Even at this stage, the conflict could have been avoided if the Russians had wanted this. The Russians and Americans had established a hotline between themselves in order that they could clarify and de-conflict fluid security situations. Situations exactly like this. The Americans picked up the phone and used it. The Russian officials, perhaps unconvincingly, denied it was anything to do with them. With the Russians suitably warned, it allowed US forces to ready a counter-response in the event of a shooting war. Although the American Special Forces were in an isolated location, they were most certainly not alone. The Air Force Operations Center in Qatar had a range of assets at its disposal, and it made them ready. Drones, AH-64 attack helicopters, F-22 Raptor stealth fighters, F-15s, B-52 strategic bombers, and AC-130 gunships, capable of bringing intensive rapid-firing cannon to bear. 20 miles away, another local US team of Special Forces and Marines were also warned and told to prepare a quick reaction force in the event that their colleagues at the Conoco plant needed backup. They were a small force as well, 20 in number, with a handful of mine-resistant armored personnel vehicles, some heavy machine guns, and some anti-tank guided missiles. By 3 p.m., the Russian-Syrian force was moving towards the Conoco plant and the American positions. There could now be little doubt about the intention. By 8:30 p.m., the T-72 tanks were within a mile of the Americans, who hunkered down, anxiously bracing themselves for an assault, while US diplomatic and military officials scrambled to the phones to warn off the Kremlin. Mercenaries and their costly mistake. At 9 p.m., a barrage of tank, artillery, and mortar fire battered the US outpost, immersing the Americans in dust, smoke, splinters, fragments of hot metal, and a wall of violent sound. The Americans replied with heavy machine gun fire and some anti-missiles. The QRF was told to get moving, but they were 20 miles away, traveling over difficult terrain with only night vision goggles to aid them in the pitch dark of the Syrian night. They would not arrive anytime soon, and their MRAP vehicles were in no way designed to go toe-to-toe with main battle tanks, even relatively old ones like the T-72. But they set off as quickly as they could, desperate to assist their comrades. But other help was already on the way, and in the air. American airstrikes, helicopters, and aircraft now struck the advancing enemy force, throwing the attack into disarray and causing high casualties among soldiers and armored vehicles. The air attack was effective, but the first wave had to depart to refuel and rearm after launching its missiles. A second wave was already being planned. A long-range Predator drone fired its Hellfire anti-tank missiles at the accompanying armor and then circled the battlefield, providing a real-time intelligence feed to the troops and commanders below. The battle lasted several hours through the night. The QRF arrived and began to engage armored targets on the horizon with 50 caliber heavy machine gun. The .50 cal is a powerful weapon introduced into the American Army in the 1920s. It cannot defeat the frontal armor of a tank, but it can cause damage to key parts of the tank, such as its machine guns, lights, radio, and communications gear, periscopes, and night vision equipment. It can cause real damage to lighter armored personnel carriers, trucks, and other support vehicles, and it will always be disconcerting for the morale of a crew to hear high-velocity pieces of metal crashing off the hull of their vehicle. The QRF claimed to have fired around 5,000 rounds of 50 cal ammunition. And the tracer rounds also served as a helpful indication of the target location for the incoming airstrikes. Not bad for a 100-year-old piece of equipment. Radio communication intercepts revealed much Russian language chatter on the airwaves as they received this aerial assault. They were getting hammered and they were not happy. It was becoming very clear that high numbers of casualties had been sustained by the Syrians and the mercenaries of the Wagner unit. The tone of communications was overwhelmingly that of shock and fear, but they were also angry that they had been pushed into a crude frontal assault without the equipment, training, and resources to do the job. It seemed that the Russians did not have effective night vision capability. "We should never have been there. Our leadership messed up. The Americans knew exactly where we were," one former Russian mercenary said afterwards. As is often the case in a confused combat situation, at one point it was reported that a Russian bomber was airborne and heading towards the battle. This caused more anxiety for the Konoko outpost, who could take no particular special countermeasures against an airstrike. As one of the team commanders advised his men, "Just tighten your helmet and lock the doors." Another wave of US aircraft arrived over the battle and discharged their weapons. The encounter came to a slow halt in the early hours of the 8th of February, when it was clear the Syrians and Russians had lost their appetite to press forward and were withdrawing. Where possibly they had begun to remove their dead and injured. It had been a tough and stressful night for the Americans. Miraculously, to their intense relief, when dawn broke, they realized that no one had been injured. There was more chatter on the Wagner side. Discussion regarding their casualties seemed to suggest they suffered massive losses, perhaps even 200 to 300 dead and injured. Many of the armored vehicles were now blackened, smoldering wrecks. An SF patrol later found an abandoned vehicle and blew it up. The odds had been daunting, 10-1 in favor of the Russians, but the Americans had overcome this imbalance with ease. Teamwork, small unit leadership, highly effective intelligence links, and well-coordinated air capability had proved crucial. 3 hours of airstrikes can be a powerful force multiplier. The aftermath. The bully had been called out, and the Russian response afterwards was muted. There was certainly no escalation of violence. Foreign Minister Lavrov blamed American provocation. The Kremlin acknowledged that 5 Russian citizens, contractors, had died, and stated that no Russian servicemen were involved, which may even have been factually accurate, and a right-wing Russian military commander, Igor Girkin, tellingly warned his Russian compatriots about the risk of traveling to Syria to fight. Subsequent Pentagon analysis concluded that about 100 Russians had been killed. The Russians had been taught a painful lesson. A month later, US intelligence gatherers identified a similar-sized Syrian-Russian battle group gathering by the Euphrates in the same area. The Americans got on the hotline to warn the Russians of the consequences of unprovoked action. This time, the Russians took heed and withdrew the force. In the years after, the Russians continued to provoke US forces in Syria with a range of hostile gestures with vehicles, aircraft, and communications jamming. There is always a risk that another larger-scale battle can break out by accident or design. In such a complex security environment, this game is certainly not over.